Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to our third lesson of our simplified Tajweed series, which is a series of Tajweed lessons introduced by Quran University, uniquely designed Quran learning management system with the purpose of introducing Tajweed in a modern and easy approach. Through this series of lessons, you will be introduced to Tajweed rules using a unique, modern and innovative approach to teach Tajweed that utilizes the color codes of Mushaf al-Tajweed as a common denominator that links those lessons to Tajweed rules. With such approach, we aim to make the understanding of Tajweed rules much easier and to practically help you to apply those rules while reading the Quran. So let's start, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, with our topic for this lesson, which is articulation and characteristics of Arabic letters. The objectives of this lesson are set to allow you to realize the difference between Ottoman script and normal text, and then help you to realize the importance of studying articulation of letters and their characteristics, and then help you to differentiate between the letters of the spoken alphabet versus those of the written one, and understand what causes sound, the pathway, airway it passes through as it comes out, and what modifies and alters its characteristics. And in order to do that, we'll be introducing some anatomy and physiology of the upper airway. In addition, we will be understanding how the letters in Arabic articulate and what are the articulation zones for those letters, and what are the characteristics of Arabic letters. Let's start by comparing Quranic script, as in Al-Fatiha here, versus a regular text like this saying of Al-Shafi'i rahmatullah alayh. Now, we'll compare first by the way of writing it and the letter used. In the Quranic script, we realize that the letters are a bit different from the regular font here, because we use what we call the Ottoman script. And in the regular normal text, we use regular font. Now, in terms of reading, the grammar rules applies on both of the two cases, while Tajweed rules applies only on Quranic script, and it's not applied upon reading the regular normal text. So, what's the importance of learning articulations and characteristics of letters? Why should we learn that? Let's take an example, a verse of the Quran. قال عسى ربي أن يهديني سواء السبيل. The word عسى means might. عسى has a letter seen in the red here. So this S, seen, if we don't pronounce it properly, if we don't articulate it properly and give it the right proper characteristics, it could be altered into a different letter. Let's take an example. If we fatten this seen, it will look or sounds like a sad, and that will convert this word to a totally different word, asa or asa. Now, the difference between these and asa in meaning is significant. Asa means to disobey, and asa means a stick, while asa means might. And as a result of not pronouncing it properly, not articulating it, or providing the proper characteristics of the letter seen, we ended up by a totally different meaning. So the meaning has completely changed due to the error in pronunciation. The alphabet and the spoken letters. The Arabic alphabet has 28 letters, while as we speak, the spoken alphabet has 29 letters, with one extra letter. It's primarily the written alphabet plus the Hamza, this one. To understand how letters are pronounced, we'll revise some background of anatomy and physiology that will help us understand how sound is generated, and then how such sounds would be modified to produce the letters that we pronounce. Let's start with the relationship between breathing and sounds. Breathing is essential for living beings to make sounds. Although breathing can take place without speaking, yet you cannot speak without breathing. Breathing is a cycle of oscillation between inhalations and exhalations. The going up part of the wave is called inhalation, followed by exhalation, followed by inhalation, then exhalation, and it continues. The cycle continues. Inhalation is sucking the air into the lungs. entering mainly through the nose, occasionally through the mouth, and passing through the airway, while exhalation is pushing the air out of the lungs, passing through the airway and leaving out mainly through the nose and occasionally from the mouth. When we speak, our normal breathing, i.e. inhalation and exhalation process, is slightly altered. Although the inhalation is the same almost, yet exhalation is different. First difference is that most of the exhaled air comes out from the mouth while speaking. Exhaled air confronts resistance as it passes through the airway, generating sounds. Such resistance can occur anywhere across the airway. First at the vocal cords, in the larynx, then at the articulation points such as the uvula, tongue, lips, or a combination of those. In addition, there are several factors that might affect the features of the produced sound. For example, bending the tongue towards the molar produces the letter dad, yet raising the same tongue but towards the palate produces the sound id. So between od and id, they sound similar, but they're not the same because of such minor changes in the way we obstruct the passage of the air as it comes out from the mouth. So let's compare regular exhalation versus sound-associated exhalation. In regular exhalation with no sound, air exhaled primarily through the nose and to a lesser degree through the mouth. Air exhaled leaves the lung without vibrating the vocal cords, while in sound-associated exhalation, air is exhaled primarily through the mouth, to a lesser degree through the nose, and air exhaled while speaking vibrates the vocal cord while leaving the lungs. Exhaled air resistance at larynx generates the sounds. The larynx is here. This is the larynx. And those are the vocal cords from here, these two cords. If we perform what we call laryngoscopy, in which we push a small camera on the tip of a fine tube through the mouth towards the larynx, then we'll be able to see the vocal cords from above. And that's how we see the vocal cords from above using the laryngoscope. And those are the two vocal cords as seen from above through the laryngoscope. And now let us watch a short video that shows the vocal cords through the laryngoscope during speaking and shows us the breathing-speaking coordination. Observe the vibration where the vocal cords vibrates during exhalation, then taking breath, inhalation, vibration again, vibration continues, and then followed by another inhalation, vibration as we speak again, and the cycle repeats itself as long as we speak. So the passing air coming from the lungs while the cords are in proximity during expiration causes the cords to vibrate, resulting in sound generation, the tone of which depends on how tense the cords are. The video we have shown you was actually at normal speed. Now we're going to show you the same video but at a slow motion in order to appreciate more the vibration of the vocal cords. Now we can see those vocal cords vibrating at slow motion, and that vibration is actually what generates the sound that we hear during speaking. Now let's discuss the resistance to the air as it passes through the airway and how that resistance would modify the sound. This is the air. It passes through the airway. The first resistance is faced by the vocal cords in the larynx, and then it passes through the throat, and some of the exhaled air passes from the nasopharynx into the nasal passages and through those through the nasal cavity to the outside. While most of the air passes through the oral cavity, first it is obstructed by the uvula, then comes the hard palate obstruction, and the major player in such obstruction would be the tongue, and also the teeth, which could obstruct at the front or the sides, and the final obstruction comes from the lips. We put a man into the magnetic resonance imaging machine, and we're going to show you the MRI taken of his head, showing the changes that happens in the air pathway as he speaks. واحد اثنان ثلاثة أربعة خمسة ستة سبعة ثمانية تسعة عشرة. I'm going now to mute the audio and then play the same video again, and let's watch together the air pathway. Watch as the tongue is elevated to touch the hard palate here, how the uvula is going backwards and obstructing the nasopharynx, how the tip of the tongue is touching the alveolar part behind the teeth here, and how the lips gets together as we pronounce letters like the wow. It is those changes to the airway shape and size, which is a reason of the coordinated movements of those organs, that gives each letter its characteristic sound. Now we can realize that the reason for the sound is basically the obstruction of all those organs to the exhaled air exiting from the lungs in its pathway to the outside world. The larynx, the uvula and soft palate, the tongue, the hard palate, the teeth, and the lips, in addition to the nasal cavity. A major factor that gives the letter its unique sound is basically the point at which it faces the maximum resistance and obstruction of the air that is coming out of the lungs during pronouncing that letter. And we call that point the articulation zone, or the point of articulation, or the place of articulation. And we can determine that point by undergoing 4 steps. First step is adding a hamza before the letter. So if the letter is a ba, we will say ab. Second, make sure that that letter is sakin. It has silence. Ab. This is the sukoon sign. And then now we pronounce it. Ab. And as we pronounce it, pronounce the combination of the hamza and the ba and the sukoon. Now we can determine the site of the articulation point by checking the area or the point of maximum interruption, the zone of maximum obstruction. For example, for the ab, we'll find that the voice or the sound has ended at the lips. Ib. These are the lips, and here's the ab ending at the lips site. That's why we call it a labial letter, because its articulation point is at the lips. Similarly, the the sound ends at the mid-throat. Here is the mid-throat, and it ends up at the mid-throat, so it's called a throat letter. Ends up at the deep throat, so it is still a throat letter, but a bit different from the Now with one more example, is a vowel. There's no real obstruction to the As it causes the vibration of the vocal cords, it continues to exit without no real obstruction. And that's why we call it a jawf letter, which means the depth of the interior, since it's coming from below the larynx, from the jawf. And is the main vowel upon which other vowels such as the E and the O are based. Now we have gained enough background to understand the Arabic letters articulations point or zones. Let's start with the first one. We're starting with the jawf letters, and these are letters that are coming from below the larynx. We call it huruf jawfiyya, and they are actually the vowels. The first vowel is and with a minor modification of the where we bring the lips together, we get the second vowel, which is oo. Similarly, with another modification of the where we depress our lower jaw, e. So oo, e are the 3 vowels of Arabic. Now we'll go to the throat letters. The throat letters, or al-huruf al-halqiyya, are 3 categories. The lower throat, those coming from the lower throat, al-hamza, al-ha, and from the mid throat we have the and the and from the upper throat we have We move now to what we call the nasal passages letter, al-khayshum or huruf al-khayshum. This is the nasal passage or the nasal zone, and here we have 2 letters, N, M, and we realize that those 2 letters has a nasal tone, N, M. In addition, they'll have the oral, also articulation point, which we'll demonstrate soon. Now, lips letters, we call it huruf shafawiyya. There are 2 types, coming from joining the 2 lips together, and we call it bilabial. We have the ib and the m. So the m is a labial letter, and it's also a nasal passage letter. It has double articulation points. Another labial letter is the non-vowel waw, waw غير المادية. Basically, this is a bit different from the other waw, which is the vowel. Here we don't extend it, and that's why we call it waw غير مادية, which means a non-extendable waw. There is one more labial letter. It's categorized as a labiodental because it articulates by bringing the lower lips with the teeth, and it is the F. F. Now, in English, there is another labiodental letter, which is the V, which we don't have in Arabic. And that's the reason for some mistakes that non-Arabic native speakers do by mixing the F sound with the IV sound. The remaining letters are basically the tongue letters or the lingual letters, حروف لسانية. And these are very important because the way the tongue is structured, it allows it to really shift itself right and left, up and down. And it acts as a major player in creating our language. The way the letters are pronounced or letters are mispronounced is primarily because of the way we play with our tongue. So, due to its importance, the lingual letters are further classified into several classifications. First, we have what we call the lingual uvular letters, ق and ik. The ik comes from the uvula, while the ik comes from the soft palate, a little bit ahead, in front of the ik. And we call this uvular حروف, uvular letters. Now, we have the letters coming from the mid of the mouth width. And this is the area where it comes from. And the letter sh. And the letter j. And we have the letter ya. Now, the ya here is similar to the waw here. This is called the non-extendable ya. It's different from the vowel e here. This is e. This is ya. This is wa. And this is oo. And those are called حروف شجرية, palatal letters coming from the wide area of the mouth below the hard palate here. Now, upper molar letters, أض. This is a very unique letter to the Arabic language, أض. And the Arabic language is called لغة الضاد, the language of the ضاد, because it's very rare in other languages and hence it's unique to Arabic. And that's why people who are learning Arabic for the first time find difficulty pronouncing the ضاد, and they usually mispronounce it for the d rather than ض. So they pronounce it like a d instead of the ضاد. The next group of lingual letters are those that comes from the tip of the tongue, or the side and the tip of the tongue, and those are the L, the N. And notice again here that the N or the noon is both a nasal letter and a lingual oral letter, similar to the meme, which is a nasal letter and an oral labial letter. So both the N and the M are letters that have dual articulation points. There is one more letter of this group, and that is the R. R. And we call this group of letters الحروف الذلقية, which means the letters of the tip and the sides of the tongue. Another group of lingual letters is those that comes from the mouth roof, from the hard palate, this area, the front end of the hard palate just behind the teeth. And this is how it looks from inside, and this is basically the area that has the ridges at the front of the hard palate here, behind the front teeth. Now, in this area, the following letters comes. The and the id, and the it. Notice the ta is again a letter which is not present in English, and another reason why people who's learning Arabic can mispronounce it for the ta. Ta is different from ta, it, and the it is in between. And those letters, we call it alveolar letter, and in Arabic it's called الحروف النطعية. Another group is the letters that comes near the gum, and this is the gum here, and where the teeth is, and another and we have ith. Now, ith and ith are there in English, but the ov is not there. And accordingly, this is another area for mispronunciation for English speakers who are learning Arabic. They usually have a difficulty pronouncing the va. The is commonly used in English, and the th is also there, but the va is a bit difficult to pronounce for them. And we call this group of letters the حروف اللثوية, from the gum. Litha means gum. The final group is the lower incisor letters, and basically we have 3 letters there that comes from touching the tongue with the lower teeth, the incisor teeth here. And here we see the incisor teeth and the black arrow points at the articulation area of those letters where the tongue touches the teeth. And the first letter is and us. And we realize that those letters has something in common. They do all have a whistling sound, and that's why we call them in Arabic حروف الصفير, the whistle letters. Let us take 2 letters that share the same articulation point. For example, 2 tongue letters from the alveolar letters group. They share the same articulation zone here, where the tongue meets the front part of the ridged hard palate. We have the ut and it. We have now the question, which is, how can we differentiate those letters sharing a common articulation zone? And to answer that, we look at those 2 letters. These 2 letters sound almost the same, ut, it, but they are actually not identical. The sound is not exactly the same. There is a difference between the 2. These 2 letters sound almost the same because they share the same articulation zone. But they are not identical in their sound because each has a different characteristics group. So basically, we can conclude that letters' characteristics are features that gives the letter its unique sound and which differentiates it from sister letters sharing the same articulation zone. Let's look at an example of such characteristic. For mim and nun, those 2 letters have what we call an alternative airflow that causes the ghunna characteristic of the mim and nun. Ghunna means a nasal tone. And to understand the cause of ghunna, we have to understand that exhalation has 2 routes for the exhaled air, mainly through the mouth and to a lesser degree from the nose. Now, this alternative airflow during exhalation from the nose is exaggerated in those 2 letters, the mim and nun, giving them a unique nasal tone characteristic, which is called ghunna. So, the mim and nun has a dual articulation. Each has 2 articulation zones, one nasal and one oral. The nasal articulation zone is located at the nasal cavity, and basically it's for both the mim and nun. While the mim has an other articulation zone, which is from the lips, where it has a bilabial articulation zone, and accordingly the mim has the oral articulation from the labial, the 2 lips together, and the nasal articulation, which gives the mim the ghunna characteristic. On the other hand, the nun has also an oral articulation zone from here, where it is a lingual related to the tip of the tongue, where it meets the hard palate at this point. So again, in the nun, the oral articulation is a lingual one from the tip of the tongue, and the nasal articulation, again, is the reason for the ghunna. So, ghunna was an example of the characteristics of the mim and nun. But all different letters have different characteristics. And in the past, the Arabic linguistic scholars had categorized the Arabic letters' characteristics into 2 major categories. First category is what they call intrinsic or basic characteristics, and the second category is the incidental or conditional characteristics. And the difference between the 2 is that in the intrinsic characteristics, the characteristics are always associated with the letter, and thus they are part of the intrinsic makeup of the letter, while in the incidental or conditional characteristics, the characteristics are not innate, where in this case the characteristics might be associated with the letter in certain occasions, while in other occasions they don't exist. So they are conditional to that particular occasion, and that's why they are not always associated with the letter, and hence not always intrinsic or basic characteristics. Now, the basic intrinsic characteristics can be further divided into those characteristics with opposites, and those are 5 pairs, 5 by 2, a total of 10. And the other group are those characteristics without opposites, and they are 7. Now, the 10 characteristics are those, and we will discuss them in details in a few minutes. And the others, the other 7, are these, and some scholars added another 2 to make the total of 9. Now, these characteristics, some of them are considered as strength characteristics, given the color red in here, while the other group, given the color green, are considered weakness characteristics. And on the right here, we're going to list the incidental conditional group of characteristics, and this is the list. Don't worry about understanding it or looking into details of this. Such details of those characteristics will be described at a later stage. And some of those characteristics would have detailed lessons dedicated to describe them at a later stage. We start first by explaining the characteristics with the opposites, those 5 pairs. And in order to do that, we're going to take 2 similar letters that share the same articulation and start to compare them using the 5 pairs of characteristics. So we have here in front of us the ta and the ta, and from the perspective of elevation, the ta is considered as an elevated character, while the ta is considered as a lower character. The second comparison will be based on adherence, where the it is an adherent character and the it is an opened character. From the perspective of volume, the ta is prominent, the ta is whispered. And that from the perspective of intensity, both are intense. And from the perspective of fluency, we find that both characters are labored. With a lot of new terms and definitions, you might be feeling a bit confused. So please don't be overwhelmed. All these new terms and definitions would be described to you in details, and you'll understand them in depth as we go through the coming few slides. And we'll start with the first 2 characteristics. Now, the ta on this right side and the ta on the left side, and we're going to look at the 2 opposing characters related to these 2 letters. On the left, we have the characteristic of elevation, isti'la, and on the right, we have the characteristic of istifal, depression. Elevation in Arabic, al-isti'la, and in cases of elevation, we do actually elevate the back of the tongue, the deepest part of the tongue, while pronouncing the letter. This is elevated towards the hard palate, and here the deepest part of the tongue being elevated upward. While in case of depression, it's the opposite. So as we pronounce the ta, it, we are lowering the deepest part of the tongue while pronouncing the letter it, compared to the tongue being elevated here. So in the it, we have an isti'la, elevation characteristic, while in the it, there is a depression or istifal characteristic. Now, the elevation has 7 letters. It's a characteristic of 7 letters, which are those: khas, dad, qad, kha, sad, da, gha, ta, qa, dha. While the depression is a characteristic of all the remaining letters of the alphabet. Now we're going to go to the next pair of opposite characteristics, and on the left side we have for the ta, adherence for al-itbaq in Arabic, versus the opening, al-infitah. Now in adherence, adhering the 2 sides of the tongue with the roof of the mouth while pronouncing the letter. So if this is the mouth, and this is the 2 sides of the tongue adhering to the roof of the mouth. Now in the opening, it's the opposite. It's separating the 2 sides of the tongue, they are down, okay, from the roof of the mouth while pronouncing the letter. See, they are not going up as in the case of the itbaq. So in adherence, there is a upward raise of the 2 sides of the tongue. In opening, there is a downward opening of the 2 sides of the tongue. There are 4 letters that has the adherence itbaq characteristic. It's the sad, dad, ta, dha. So the ta has an adherence characteristic. On the other side, the opening, infitah, is a characteristic of all the remaining 25 other letters of the alphabet, including the ta, it. And now we're going to describe another 2 pairs of characteristics. But before that, let's have some background about the physics of sound. Transmission of sound is caused by compression-decompression of air particles. and this is caused by the oscillation of a sound source. And as a result, there is a wave of sound that is generated that has a wavelength and that also has a maximum pressure and a minimum pressure. Now, in case of humans, the source of this sound is basically the vibration of the vocal cords, and that vibration of the vocal cords causes fluctuating compression and decompression of the exhaled air particles as it passes beyond the vocal cords towards the outside. Here we see the vibration of the vocal cords to the right and left oscillating, which in turn leads to oscillation in the air compression in front of it. Here we see an air particle or atom oscillating back and forth in movement, with an initial acceleration reaching a peak to accelerate to the right, then it slows down gradually, decelerating to a standstill, then it changes its direction and accelerates to the left, then slows down to a standstill, then the cycle repeats itself. Now, such vibration in the air pressure would be transferred towards the ear, where the mechanical vibration of the air would lead to vibration of the eardrum, which would cause the small ear bones to move, leading to the stimulation of the inner ear apparatus, that at the end would lead to a triggering of a nerve stimulus that would be sent to the brain to appreciate the sound and recognize it. So in short, speakers, vocal cord vibration, cause sound waves. Sound waves travel through air to stimulate the recipient ear to be eventually recognized by the listener's brain. Now, let's utilize what we have just learned about the sound wave, and let's compare these two sound waves, this one and this one. We'll realize that there is an increase in the number of the waves in the lower sound wave. Now let's look at these two, the upper one here and the one below here. The number of the sound waves is the same, but there is an increase in the amplitude. So in the first one, there is an increase in the number of the waves, which we call it the frequency, while in the second one, there is an increase in the amplitude, the height of the wave. And as a result of the increase in the amplitude, there would be an increase in the sound volume. While on the left side, the increase in the frequency, the oscillation speed, would actually lead to increased sound intensity. Now, we can differentiate between an increased volume of the sound and increased intensity of the sound. Now, we can go back to our ta and ta comparison, and let's look at their waves. The ta sound wave looks like that, while the ta sound wave looks like this. And we conclude that the volume of the ta is higher because it has a higher amplitude, and hence we call the ta to have a prominent characteristic. While on the other hand, the ta has a smaller amplitude, and accordingly the volume is lower, so we give the ta the whispered characteristic. Now, if we look at these two waves, we realize that both has the same number of waves, accordingly the same frequency, and as a result, we conclude that from intensity perspective, both letters are intense. Now, both letters are different in volume. The ta is prominent, the ta is whispered, so the two letters are different in volume. Now, on the other hand, the two letters are similar in intensity, having the same frequency. Let's now concentrate on the volume characteristics of both the ta and ta. So if we look further on the ta wave and compare it to the ta wave, we realize the ta wave is more prominent and it has a higher sound volume compared to the ta wave, which has a whisper characteristic due to the low sound volume. Now, the reason for the prominence for the ta is caused due to the strong imprisonment of the exhaled air flow, leading to generation of a high volume sound waves. While in the ta, the incomplete, which is basically the weak imprisonment of the exhaled breath flow, keeps the volume of the sound low. If we put our fingers on our larynx and say ut or then we can feel the vibration of the sound cord transferred towards our fingers on the surface of the skin, and that's due to the high volume of the oscillation. While on the other hand, if we put our fingers over the larynx and try to say it, or it will be more obvious if we say ish or is, where in this situation we wouldn't be able to feel this vibration of the sound cord, and basically this is because of the low volume leading to less transfer of the sound that it would mechanically not be transferred to the surface of the skin and would not be felt by our fingers. The whisper letters are basically 10 letters gathered in the sentence سكت فحثه شخص. The سين ك تا اف ح ث ه ish خ صاد, while the prominence is basically the remaining alphabet, the 19 remaining letters. Now let's look at the intensity characteristics of the ta and ta. The ta and ta both has the same frequency, so they have the same intensity. So we need to take a different letter to compare with. We're going to take now the f. So the ta and ta are intense letters. They have the characteristic of intensity, al-shidda. While on the other hand, the f is having the characteristic of looseness, or al-rakhawa. We can see the wave is loose. And if we go back to the intensity and try to define it, we'd realize that the intensity, or al-shidda, is caused by the articulation point having a sudden blockage caused by a stricture imprisoning the exhaled air. So if we consider the exhaled air is passing this way through this tube, and there is sudden rays of something blocking its pathway, like the tongue, for example, rising upward towards the soft palate, then it causes a stricture here that imprisons the air behind it, and that imprisonment would cause the air pressure to build up, and when released, would cause the air to burst out, resulting in a sharp sound, which is actually what gives the high frequency of the wave. And that's why intense letters usually have shorter pronunciation time, it, when compared to loose letters like the f, which has a longer sound wave and longer pronunciation time. Let's now look at the looseness characteristic, and we will see that there is always a leakage of the exhaled air. Now, that leakage happens at the articulation point due to weak blockage, so the blockage here is not as complete as it was here, causing a stricture. The tongue is not as raised as in this case, so there is a space between the hard palate and the tongue, and that results in a soft sound with a low frequency wave, as we see here, and as we have now realized that the soft letter is associated with a longer pronunciation time. Now, we'll see the air escaping between the hard palate and the tongue, so it's not really blocked, and as it's in the case of the intense letters, and that's why that air keeps on leaking around, and the f would never have the intensity of the ut or the it. The letters associated with intensity are 8 letters gathered in this sentence: ajid, qat, bakat. Now, the rest of the letters would be 21 letters. The rest of the alphabet are looseness-related letters. But some scholars, linguistic scholars, do further divide those 21 letters into further 2 categories: Lan Umar letters, which they consider as an intermediate looseness. They consider them between intensity and looseness, and the rest, which they consider as having the full looseness. We'll now talk about the last of the 5 pairs, which is related to fluency, and look at the ta and ta here. Both of them are called labored. They are characterized of being labored compared to the fluent. So what's the fluent? The fluent are easy to pronounce letters because their articulation points allows them to easily depart the mouth. They are either letters of the tip of the tongue or the letters of the tip of the lips. And those are basically like the L and the F. We can see that they are easily pronounced compared to the labored letters. And they are 6 letters, 3 from the tip of the tongue, the L, N, R, and the 3 from the tip of the lips, the ib, the F, and the M. While the labored letters are the rest. They are letters that are not at the tip of the tongue or the lips, and they're a bit more difficult to pronounce. It takes time. It is labored compared to L and F. Now, the labored letters are the remaining 23 letters of the rest of the alphabet. We can now summarize the characteristics with opposites for the ta and ta in one table that summarize them all. And similarly, we can put all the alphabet letters and put those 5 pairs of characteristics with opposite, and you'll find that for every letter in the alphabet there are a unique set of characteristics among these 10 characteristics with opposite. And this is the ta and ta in this overall table. So we have covered the 5 sets here and the other opposite 5, and now we'll move to the characteristic, the intrinsic basic ones without opposite. We'll quickly run through them. We'll not take them in details. The whistle is basically the sound characteristic which gives a whistling sound like when we blow air through whistle holes. And this is a characteristic of the sin and the sad and the zain of 3 letters. Is, us, is. The qalqala is another unique basic intrinsic characteristic to these letters, qa, ta, ba, ja, da. We put them together in qutb jad, where we increase the sound tone upon stopping on one of those letters. The deviation is basically when we deviate from a characteristic of the letter to another one. The diffusion is a characteristic of the ish, sheen, where there is a spread out of the air being blown out. Shh. It is only special for this letter. Now, the trembling is a characteristic special for the r. Trembling of the r is caused by multiple brief complete blockages in a row caused by the tongue, leading to a vibration of the sound of the r. Lengthening is a characteristic of the letter dad, and it's due to coexistence of its other characteristics, elevation and loudness together. It's very unique for the dad. Now, nasalization or ghunna is a very important characteristic of both letters, the m and the nun. The m, n, those 2 letters have, as we mentioned before, dual articulation. The nasal articulation allows the air to pass through the nasal passages, generating the nasal tone of the sound of the meme and nun. Again, don't forget, this is no more than an introduction. You don't need to remember anything about those. All what you need to remember is that there is intrinsic basic characters with opposite and another group of characters without opposite. You'll have enough time to understand each of those characteristics, which will be explained in details in the future lessons of this simplified Tajweed series. Lastly, but not least, we're going to quickly go through the list of the incidental conditional characteristics, and as we mentioned before, those are the characteristics that might be associated with the letter in certain occasions and may not be associated with it in other occasions. We'll start with the first on the list, which is velarization, tafkhim, and attenuation, tarqiq. Velarization means tafkhim, and that happens for 2 letters, the lam and ra, il and where we move the back of the tongue towards the velum, and hence the name velarization. So when we move it up to the velum, it results in fattening of the letter and giving it an echo sound. And opposite to velarization is attenuation and tarqiq. The other 2, which is basically to cover, akhfa, or to uncover, idhar, which means to show, and merge or idgham, which means to bring 2 together, are all those are characteristics of the nun and meme, and they are incidental characteristics of those 2 letters, and they appear in the rules of the nun sakina and tanween, and nun sakina with tanween, and the silent meme, the meme sakina, and in the stressed meme and nun, al-meme wa nun al-mushaddadatain. Now, stretch means mad, and squeeze, which means qasr, are opposing characteristics related to vowels. Basically, they are incidental characteristics of the vowels a, u, e, where the rules of mad and lean would be applied. Then we have the vowel movements, the haraka, and opposite to it is the still, the sukoon. Any Arabic letter can be activated, which means given a characteristic of vowel movement, haraka, or deactivated, which means being deprived from such mobility, and that's what we call sukoon. Again, don't worry about these. All these again will have its own lessons that will describe each one of those in details later on. Last but not least is the qalqala, where qalqala is a characteristic that increase sound tone upon stopping on one of these letters. Qa, ta, ba, jim, dal. And I'll remind you before we finish up this lesson that whatever details we've given now are meant to be an introduction for the articulation points and the characteristics of letters. You don't need to worry about understanding the details of those because all these would be repeated again in details in the following lessons. And before we finish, we'll quickly revise what we have learned in this lesson. We have learned about the difference between the Ottoman script and the normal text, and the difference between the spoken Arabic alphabet and the written one, and the importance of studying the articulation of letters and their characteristics. And then we took a background on the anatomy, physiology, and physics of what causes the sound and the pathway it takes through its passing out of the body and what modifies and alters its characteristics. We studied the articulation points and zones of the Arabic alphabet, and we've learned about the characteristics of the Arabic alphabet. And with that, we reach the conclusion of this current lesson on the articulation and characteristics of the Arabic alphabet. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that بعونه وقدرته that the Quran Learning Management System, برنامج الجامع لحفظة كتاب الله, would help you, inshallah, to improve your tajweed and improve your tilawa and help you in improving your recitation and help you, if you want, in memorizing the Quran and to help you understand the Quran in the proper way. As we reach the end, we ask Al-Mawla Azza wa Jal أن يتقبل منا هذا العمل. We ask Allah Almighty to accept this work from us, and we ask you to make dua for those who participated in making this work come to life and reach you. Hoping you all the best. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.